The coffee cup slipped from Elena Martinez's right hand as she reached for the salt shaker, crashing against the kitchen floor of the Double Creek Ranch. Steam rose from the dark puddle as she stood frozen, her left arm pressed tightly against her side, hidden beneath the oversized flannel shirt she always wore. From the doorway, ranch owner Jake Whitman watched the scene unfold, his massive frame filling the entrance as he noticed something he'd been curious about for weeks. Elena never, not once, used her left hand for anything. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had arrived at the Double Creek Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue and the autumn air carried the scent of dying grass and distant snow. She'd responded to Jake's newspaper ad for a cook, showing up at his door with nothing but a worn duffel bag and references from 3 different diners across Wyoming and Colorado. Her resume was spotless: 10 years of professional cooking experience, glowing recommendations, and a quiet confidence that impressed Jake immediately. What struck him first wasn't her cooking credentials or her soft-spoken demeanor, but her size. Elena barely reached 5 feet tall, a stark contrast to Jake's 6'8" frame that had earned him the nickname Giant since high school. She looked almost childlike standing in a sprawling ranch house kitchen, surrounded by industrial-sized appliances and countertops that seemed designed for someone twice her height. The pay is $4,000 a month, plus room and board, Jake had explained during their brief interview, gesturing toward the small apartment above the kitchen that came with the job. I've got 12 ranch hands who eat like they're preparing for hibernation, and I'm tired of living on canned beans and burnt steaks. Elena had accepted without negotiation, moving into the apartment that same afternoon. Within hours, the kitchen filled with aromas Jake hadn't experienced since his grandmother's passing 15 years earlier. Fresh bread, slow-cooked stews, and perfectly seasoned roasts that made his ranch hands gather around the dining table like wolves circling prey. But something was off. Jake first noticed it during Elena's second week, when she was preparing dinner for the crew. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and seasoning dishes with remarkable skill. Yet everything, absolutely everything, was done with her right hand only. Her left arm remained tucked against her side, the hand either buried in her pocket or concealed beneath whatever loose-fitting shirt she wore that day. Initially, Jake assumed she might be left-handed and simply preferred using her dominant hand for cooking. But as days turned into weeks, he realized Elena's left hand never appeared. Not when she was kneading dough, not when she was lifting heavy pots, not even when she was carrying multiple plates to the dining room. She navigated every kitchen task with the determination of someone who had trained themselves to function with only half their natural tools. The ranch hands adored her cooking but seemed oblivious to her peculiar habits. They'd gather for meals 3 times daily, praising her homemade biscuits and perfectly grilled steaks, completely unaware that their diminutive cook was performing culinary miracles while essentially operating with one hand tied behind her back. Jake found himself watching Elena more closely, not out of suspicion, but from genuine curiosity mixed with growing concern. During busy breakfast preparations, when she was scrambling eggs for 14 hungry men, while simultaneously flipping pancakes and frying bacon, he'd noticed the slight strain in her movements. The way she'd pause momentarily when reaching for something on her left side, forcing herself to pivot her entire body rather than simply extending her left arm. The coffee cup incident happened during the 3rd week of October, when the first snow had begun dusting the mountain peaks surrounding the ranch. Elena was preparing lunch, moving between the stovetop and counter with her usual one-handed ballet, when Jake entered the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee. She was seasoning a large pot of chili, her right hand sprinkling salt while her left remained hidden when she reached across her body for the coffee pot. The movement was awkward, requiring her to stretch her right arm at an uncomfortable angle while maintaining her balance. The coffee cup, filled nearly to the brim, slipped from her grasp and shattered against the tile floor. Hot coffee splashed across the kitchen, and Elena stood perfectly still, staring down at the mess with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "I'll clean that up," she said quietly, already moving toward the supply closet for a mop. "Don't worry about it," Jake replied, but Elena was already on her knees, carefully picking up the larger pieces of ceramic. "Elena, really, leave it. I'll handle the cleanup." She looked up at him then, and Jake saw something in her dark eyes that made his chest tighten. Not embarrassment or frustration over the broken cup, but something deeper. Fear, maybe, or resignation. As if she'd been expecting this moment and dreading it simultaneously. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so softly Jake almost missed it over the bubbling of the chili on the stove. "For breaking a cup?" "Elena, I've broken more dishes than I can count. It's not a big deal." But she was already standing, moving toward the sink with the ceramic pieces cupped in her right palm. Her left arm remained pressed against her side, and Jake noticed for the first time how her oversized flannel shirt was pulled taut across her shoulder, as if something underneath was creating an unusual shape. That evening, after the ranch hands had finished dinner and retreated to the bunkhouse for their nightly poker game, Jake found himself unable to concentrate on the accounting books spread across his office desk. The image of Elena's face after dropping the coffee cup kept intruding on his thoughts. The fear in her eyes, the way she'd apologized as if breaking a cheap ceramic mug was somehow a grave offense. He'd hired dozens of people over the years to work various positions on the Double Creek Ranch. Temporary, hands during calving season, part-time help during hay harvest, even a few full-time employees who'd stayed for multiple seasons. Jake considered himself a fair judge of character, and Elena struck him as someone running from something. Not necessarily trouble with the law or outstanding debts, but something personal and painful that had driven her to seek employment at a remote cattle ranch in rural Montana. The next morning, Jake made a point of arriving in the kitchen earlier than usual, hoping to observe Elena's morning routine without seeming intrusive. She was already at work, preparing breakfast for the crew, moving through the space with the same one-handed precision he'd grown accustomed to watching. "Morning, Elena," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "It smells incredible here." "Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. Jake had asked her repeatedly to call him by his first name, but Elena maintained a formal distance that seemed impenetrable. She treated him with respect and courtesy, but never allowed their interactions to become personal or casual. Even during their brief conversations, she kept her responses short and focused on ranch business or meal planning. "I was thinking," Jake said, settling into a chair at the kitchen island where he could watch her work, "maybe we should look into getting some equipment that might make your job easier. A stand mixer maybe, or one of those food processors that can handle large quantities." Elena paused in her bacon flipping, glancing at him with something that might have been wariness. "The kitchen is well equipped, Mr. Whitman. I don't need anything additional. I just thought it might help with some of the heavier tasks. Kneading bread for 14 people, for instance, or mixing large batches of dough. I manage fine," she replied, turning back to the stove with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. But Jake wasn't ready to drop the subject. He'd spent the previous evening researching adaptive kitchen equipment online, discovering an entire world of tools designed for people with limited mobility or use of their limbs. One-handed cutting boards, ergonomic utensils, automated mixing systems, products that could potentially make Elena's work significantly easier if she was indeed dealing with some kind of physical limitation. "Elena," he said carefully, "if there's any accommodation I can make to help you do your job more comfortably, I hope you know you can ask." She turned to face him then, and Jake saw her shoulders tense beneath the loose flannel shirt. For a moment, he thought she might actually explain her situation, might trust him enough to share whatever secret she was keeping. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her cooking, effectively ending the conversation. The breakthrough came 2 days later, during the evening cleanup after dinner. Jake had stayed late in his office, reviewing cattle prices and planning the next day's work schedule when he heard the sound of running water from the kitchen. Elena typically finished cleaning by 8 o'clock, but it was nearly 9:30, and the lights were still on. Concerned that she might be dealing with some kind of equipment problem, Jake walked quietly toward the kitchen, intending to offer assistance. The swinging door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see Elena standing at the industrial sink. Her back to the doorway, she had removed her flannel shirt. What Jake saw made his breath catch in his throat. Elena's left arm, from shoulder to fingertips, was a roadmap of scars. Thick, raised welts crisscrossed her skin in patterns that spoke of repeated trauma, deliberate damage inflicted over time. Her hand, he could see now, was twisted at an unnatural angle. The fingers curved inward in a way that suggested permanent damage to tendons and nerves. She was attempting to wash a large roasting pan, struggling to maneuver it with only her right hand while her damaged left arm hung uselessly at her side. The task that should have taken minutes was stretching into a prolonged battle, her small frame shaking with effort as she tried to scrub the heavy pan clean. Jake stepped back from the doorway, his heart pounding with a mixture of shock and rage. The scars on Elena's arm weren't the result of an accident or medical condition. They were the deliberate marks of someone who had been tortured systematically and repeatedly, until her left hand had been rendered permanently useless. He retreated to his office, closing the door quietly and sinking into his desk chair as the full implications of what he'd witnessed began to sink in. Elena wasn't just a skilled cook seeking employment at a remote ranch. She was a survivor, someone who had endured unimaginable cruelty and was now trying to rebuild her life with the limited tools she had left. The next morning, Jake found himself unable to look Elena in the eye during breakfast. Every time he glanced at her moving efficiently through the kitchen with her damaged arm hidden beneath another oversized shirt, he felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. He barely knew this woman, had employed her for less than a month, yet the sight of her scars had awakened something fierce and territorial in his chest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena seemed to sense his changed behavior. She kept her interactions with him brief and professional, as always, but Jake noticed her watching him with the same wariness she'd shown when he'd offered to buy additional kitchen equipment, as if she was waiting for him to confront her about something. Dreading the conversation but expecting it nonetheless. Jake spent the morning working with his ranch hands, moving cattle from the upper pastures down to the winter feeding areas. The physical labor usually helped clear his mind, but today he found himself distracted, his thoughts returning repeatedly to the image of Elena struggling alone in the kitchen. Too proud or too frightened to ask for help with tasks that should have been simple. By lunchtime, he had made a decision. Jake's decision crystallized during the afternoon cattle roundup, when ranch hand Tommy Sullivan made an offhand comment about Elena's cooking that stopped Jake cold in his tracks. "That little lady sure knows her way around a kitchen," Tommy said, adjusting his position in the saddle as they guided a stubborn heifer toward the feeding area. "Reminds me of my ex-wife's sister. She was a cook down in Tucson before her husband damn near killed her. Lost the use of her right arm, but kept working anyway. Toughest woman I ever met." The casual comparison hit Jake like a physical blow. Tommy had no idea how close to the truth his observation might be, but the parallel was too stark to ignore. Elena wasn't just hiding a physical disability. She was hiding from someone who had inflicted that disability deliberately and systematically. When they returned to the ranch that evening, Jake found himself studying Elena's behavior with new eyes. The way she positioned herself near the kitchen's back door during meal preparation, as if planning escape routes. How she flinched slightly whenever one of the ranch hands raised their voice, even in laughter. The careful way she counted every person in the dining room before serving meals, as if conducting a mental head count for her own safety. Elena had transformed the ranch's mealtimes from functional fuel stops into genuine social gatherings. The ranch hands lingered over her homemade pies and perfectly seasoned roasts, sharing stories and jokes in a way they never had during Jake's bachelor cooking era. But Elena herself never joined these conversations. She served the food, accepted compliments with quiet nods, and retreated to the kitchen to begin preparing for the next meal. After dinner, Jake lingered in the dining area longer than usual, pretending to review supply catalogs while actually listening to Elena move through her evening cleanup routine. The sounds were different now that he knew what to listen for. The extra time required for tasks that should have been simple. The occasional muffled curse when something slipped from her single functioning hand. The careful placement of dishes and utensils in patterns that accommodated her limitations. When the kitchen finally fell silent, Jake waited another 20 minutes before making his move. He knocked softly on the door leading to Elena's upstairs apartment, his massive frame feeling awkward and intrusive in the narrow stairwell. "Elena, could I speak with you for a moment?" The silence stretched so long that Jake wondered if she'd chosen to ignore him. Finally, her voice came through the door, barely above a whisper. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitman?" "Everything's fine. I just wanted to discuss something with you, if you have time." Another pause, then the sound of locks turning, multiple locks. Jake realized far more than the single deadbolt that had originally secured the apartment door. When Elena finally opened the door, she was wearing a heavy robe that covered her from neck to ankles, her damaged arm completely concealed. "What can I help you with?" she asked, not inviting him inside, but not closing the door either. Jake had rehearsed this conversation during his ride back from the pastures, but now that he was facing Elena directly, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you tell someone you've discovered their most carefully guarded secret without sounding like a voyeur or a threat? "I wanted to talk about making some changes to the kitchen setup," he began, opting for an indirect approach. "I've been thinking about what might make your job easier, and I'd like to install some new equipment." Elena's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed her grip tighten on the doorframe. "As I mentioned before, Mr. Whitman, the kitchen is adequately equipped. I know what you said, but I disagree." Jake took a careful step back, trying to appear less intimidating in the narrow space. "I think there are tools that could help you work more efficiently and with less physical strain." "I don't need help," Elena replied, but there was something desperate in her voice that contradicted her words. "Elena," Jake said gently, "I saw your arm." The color drained from Elena's face so quickly that Jake thought she might faint. She gripped the door frame with her right hand, her knuckles white with tension, and for a moment, Jake was certain she was going to slam the door in his face and disappear into the night. Instead, she asked a single question that broke Jake's heart. "Are you going to fire me?" "Fire you?" Jake was genuinely shocked. "Elena, why would I fire you? You're the best cook this ranch has ever had. The men are happier, the meals are incredible, and you've transformed this place." "Because I lied on my application," she whispered. "I didn't mention the disability. I know employers have the right to know about physical limitations that might affect job performance." Jake felt a surge of anger, not at Elena but at whatever circumstances had taught her to view her survival as a form of deception. "You didn't lie about anything that matters. You can do the job better than anyone I've ever hired. What happened to your arm doesn't change that." Elena stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of judgment or pity. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her slightly, because she stepped back and gestured for him to enter the small apartment. The space was spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. Elena had added small touches that made it feel homey. A few books stacked on the windowsill, a potted plant thriving in the afternoon sunlight, and photographs that she quickly moved to face down as Jake entered. "I don't usually have visitors," she explained, settling into a chair that positioned her damaged arm away from Jake's line of sight. Jake chose the couch across from her, trying to make his large frame appear as non-threatening as possible. "Elena, I want you to know that your job here is secure. Nothing about what I saw changes that. But I also want you to know that if you need accommodations or equipment that would make your work easier, I'm happy to provide them." "You don't understand," Elena said, her voice so quiet Jake had to lean forward to hear her. "It's not just about the equipment. It's about staying invisible, not drawing attention, not giving anyone a reason to ask questions. Questions about what happened to you." Elena nodded, her right hand unconsciously moving to cover her left arm, even though it was already hidden beneath the thick robe. "Questions about where I came from, why I left, whether anyone might be looking for me." The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Jake had suspected Elena was running from something, but hearing her confirm it directly made the situation feel more urgent and dangerous. "How long has it been?" Jake asked carefully. "Since I left? 8 months. Since it stopped?" Elena's laugh was bitter and hollow. "It never really stops. The physical damage is permanent, but the rest of it, that follows you everywhere." Jake wanted to ask who had done this to her, wanted to demand names and locations so he could exact the kind of justice that men like him had been dispensing on the frontier for generations. But Elena's posture told him she wasn't ready for those questions, might never be ready for them. "What can I do to help?" he asked instead. "You've already done it," Elena replied. "You gave me a job, a place to live, a chance to prove I can still be useful despite." She gestured vaguely toward her hidden arm. "Most people don't get that opportunity." "Most people are idiots," Jake said bluntly, earning a surprised smile from Elena, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived at the ranch. "Elena, I meant what I said about the kitchen equipment. Not because I think you can't do the job, but because I think you're working twice as hard as you should have to." Elena was quiet for several minutes, staring out the small window that overlooked the ranch's main yard. Jake could see her internal struggle playing out. Across her features, the desire for help warring with the need to maintain her carefully constructed independence. "There's a cutting board," she finally said. "I saw it in a catalog once. It has raised edges and suction cups to hold vegetables in place while you chop with one hand. And there are mix-in bowls with high sides and non-slip bases that make it easier to." She trailed off, as if embarrassed by her own admissions of need. "I'll order them tomorrow," Jake said immediately. "Anything else?" "A stand mixer would help with bread and pastry preparation. And maybe one of those jar openers that mounts under a cabinet." Elena paused, then added quietly, "I've been using my teeth to open jars for 8 months. Jake's hands clenched into fists at the image of Elena struggling with such basic tasks, too proud or too frightened to ask for help. "We'll get everything you need. And Elena, if there's anything else, anything at all, you just have to ask." "Why?" The question seemed to surprise Elena herself, as if she hadn't meant to voice it aloud. "Why what? Why are you being so kind? Most people, when they find out someone is damaged," she gestured again toward her arm, "they either treat you like you're made of glass or like you're contaminated. You're doing neither." Jake considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, a mixture of respect for Elena's strength, anger at whoever had hurt her, and a growing protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. But he sensed Elena needed something simpler, more straightforward. "Because you're not damaged," he said finally. "You're surviving, and from where I sit, you're doing a damn good job of it." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly blinked. "Back. It's been a long time since someone saw it that way." "Then you've been around the wrong people." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Elena seemed more relaxed than Jake had ever seen her, as if the burden of her secret had been lightened by sharing it with someone who didn't judge her for it. "The ranch hands," Elena said eventually. "Do they know?" "They know you're an incredible cook who makes their lives better every day. That's all they need to know." Elena nodded, relief evident in her posture. "I'd like to keep it that way, if possible." "Your business is your business," Jake assured her. "But Elena, if you ever need to talk about it, about what happened, about who might be looking for you, about anything, I'm here." "Thank you," she whispered. "I haven't had anyone to talk to in 8 months." Jake left Elena's apartment that night with a renewed sense of purpose. The woman had been through hell and emerged determined to rebuild her life through sheer force of will. The least he could do was make sure she had the tools and security she needed to succeed. The next morning, Jake drove into town to place orders for adaptive kitchen equipment, but his real destination was the sheriff's office. If Elena was hiding from someone dangerous enough to have tortured her systematically, Jake wanted to make sure the local law enforcement was aware they might have a problem heading their way. Sheriff Marcus Hawkins had known Jake Whitman since. They were kids attending the same one-room schoolhouse outside Whitefish. They'd played football together in high school, shared beers during their 20s, and maintained the kind of friendship that required no regular maintenance, but could be activated instantly when needed. So when Jake walked into the sheriff's office at 7 in the morning, requesting a private conversation, Marcus knew something serious was brewing. "Coffee?" Marcus offered, gesturing toward the ancient percolator that had been gurgling in the corner since before dawn. "Thanks." Jake accepted the chipped mug, noting how his hands dwarfed the ceramic just as they dwarfed most things in his oversized world. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about my new cook. Elena Martinez, nice lady. Picked up supplies at Henderson's hardware store a few times. Always polite, pays in cash, keeps to herself." Marcus settled behind his desk, his experienced cop instincts already sharpening. "What about her?" Jake chose his words carefully, aware that he was violating Elena's privacy, but convinced her safety trumped her secrets. "I think she's running from someone who hurt her badly. Someone who might still be looking for her." Marcus leaned forward, his casual demeanor shifting into professional mode. "What kind of hurt are we talking about?" "The kind that leaves permanent scars and destroys someone's ability to use their dominant hand." Jake's voice carried the controlled anger that had been building since he'd witnessed Elena struggling alone in the kitchen. "Marcus, I've seen torture victims in the military. What was done to this woman was systematic and deliberate." "She told you this directly?" "She confirmed she's been running for 8 months. She's terrified of being found, and she's convinced whoever hurt her is still looking." Jake met his old friend's eyes across the desk. "I need to know if anyone's been asking questions about new arrivals in the area, especially women matching Elena's description." Marcus pulled out a worn notebook and flipped through several pages. "Haven't had any inquiries like that through official channels. But you know as well as I do that the kind of people who do what you're describing don't usually call the sheriff's office for help. That's what I was afraid of." "Jake, what exactly are you asking me to do here?" "I can't launch an investigation based on suspicions, and if this woman hasn't filed a complaint or requested protection." "I'm asking you to keep your ears open," Jake interrupted, "and maybe put the word out to neighboring departments that if anyone comes around asking questions about Elena Martinez, you'd like to know about it." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can do that, unofficially of course." But Jake, if this situation is as serious as you think it is, maybe your cook should consider relocating again. Montana's not exactly known for its anonymity, especially not in towns this size. She's been running for 8 months, Marcus. She's exhausted, traumatized, and she's finally found a place where she feels safe enough to stop moving. I'm not going to be the one to tell her she has to pack up and disappear again, even if staying puts her in more danger. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as he considered the question. The truth was, he didn't know what the right answer was. Elena deserved safety and peace, but she also deserved the chance to rebuild her life somewhere. She felt at home. The Double Creek Ranch had given her that opportunity, and Jake wasn't ready to take it away based on hypothetical threats. Let's just keep our eyes open for now, he said finally. If anyone starts sniffing around, we'll reassess. Marcus made a note in his book and looked up at Jake, with the expression of someone who'd seen too many domestic violence cases end badly. For what it's worth, I hope you're wrong about all this. But my gut tells me you're not. Jake left the sheriff's office feeling marginally better about Elena's security, but increasingly aware of how exposed the ranch was to outside threats. The Double Creek sat 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, connected to the main road by a single gravel driveway that wound through open pasture land. Privacy was one of the property's greatest assets, but it also meant that trouble could approach without witnesses or interference. On his drive back to the ranch, Jake found himself mentally cataloging the property's defensive advantages and vulnerabilities. The main house sat on elevated ground with clear sightlines in all directions. The ranch hand's bunkhouse was positioned to provide additional eyes and manpower if needed. But the kitchen where Elena spent most of her time had large windows facing multiple directions, and her upstairs apartment could easily be accessed by anyone willing to climb the external staircase. The adaptive kitchen equipment Jake had ordered wouldn't arrive for another week, but he stopped at 3 different stores in town to pick up temporary solutions. A rubber jar opener, a set of lightweight mixing bowls with non-slip bases, and a cutting board with raised edges that could be operated one-handed. Small things that might make Elena's daily work less of a physical struggle while they waited for the specialized equipment. When Jake returned to the ranch, he found Elena preparing lunch with her usual efficient determination. She looked up as he entered the kitchen, and Jake noticed she seemed more relaxed than she had since her arrival. The burden of carrying her secret alone had been replaced by the relief of having someone who knew and didn't judge. I picked up a few things that might help, Jake said, setting the packages on the counter. Nothing fancy, just some temporary solutions until the better equipment arrives. Elena unpacked the items with quiet gratitude, running her fingers over the rubber jar opener with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply. "I haven't been able to open anything larger than a pickle jar since ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. Since someone had destroyed her left hand so thoroughly that simple tasks became monumental challenges. "There's something else," Jake said, settling onto the stool at the kitchen island where he'd become accustomed to watching Elena work. "I talked to Sheriff Hawkins this morning. Nothing official, just asked him to keep his ears open in case anyone comes around asking questions about you." Elena's hands stilled on the cutting board, her entire body tensing. "What did you tell him?" "Only what he needed to know to help keep you safe. That you're running from someone dangerous and that person might still be looking for you." "Did you mention my name?" "I had to, Elena. He's already met you, and if someone comes looking, they're going to have your name anyway." Elena nodded, but Jake could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. The brief respite of feeling safe was being replaced by the familiar anxiety of being hunted. "Hey," Jake said gently. "This is just a precaution. It doesn't mean anything's going to happen." "In my experience," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "something always happens eventually." The lunch crowd arrived before Jake could respond, filling the dining room with the usual chatter and laughter that accompanied Elena's meals. Jake watched her serve the ranch hands with practiced efficiency, noting how she positioned herself to keep the kitchen's back door in her peripheral vision at all times. The woman was constantly calculating escape routes, even in the safety of her own workspace. That afternoon, Jake made a decision that would have seemed paranoid under different circumstances but felt entirely reasonable given what he knew about Elena's situation. He drove to the gun store in town and purchased a high-quality security system for the ranch house, complete with motion sensors, cameras, and an alarm that would wake the dead. "Planning to catch some cattle rustlers?" asked Bob Freeman, the store owner, as he rang up the substantial purchase. "Something like that," Jake replied, not wanting to elaborate on his real concerns. The installation took the better part of 2 days, with Jake positioning cameras to provide complete coverage of all approaches to the main house and Elena's apartment. He set up motion sensors along the main driveway and placed additional cameras near the barn and bunkhouse. If anyone approached the Double Creek Ranch with ill intentions, Jake would know about it long before they reached the kitchen. Elena watched the installation process with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that was painful to witness. "You shouldn't have to turn your home into a fortress because of me," she said as Jake tested the camera feeds on his laptop. "I'm not doing this because I have to," Jake replied. "I'm doing it because I want to. Because you deserve to feel safe. And because I sleep better knowing you're protected." "But the expense." "Elena, I've been meaning to upgrade the ranch's security for years. This just gave me the motivation to actually do it." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Elena seemed grateful for the fiction that allowed her to accept help without feeling like a burden. The new equipment arrived the following Tuesday, delivered by a truck driver who seemed impressed by the ranch's remote location and Jake's obvious prosperity. Elena helped unpack the specialized kitchen tools with an enthusiasm Jake hadn't seen from her before, the first sign that she was beginning to believe she might actually be able to build a permanent life at the Double Creek. The adaptive cutting board was a marvel of engineering, with raised edges that held vegetables in place and suction cups that secured it to the counter. The stand mixer eliminated the need for the exhausting one-handed kneading that had been leaving Elena's right arm sore and cramped. The jar opener mounted under the cabinet allowed her to open containers with a simple twisting motion that required no grip strength in her damaged hand. "It's like getting my independence back," Elena told Jake as she experimented with the new tools. "I haven't felt this capable in the kitchen since before ... Again, she didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. Before someone had systematically destroyed her ability to perform the work she loved, the ranch hands noticed the difference immediately. Elena's meals became even more elaborate and varied as she regained access to cooking techniques that had been impossible with her physical limitations. Homemade pasta appeared on the dinner table, followed by delicate pastries that required precise timing and coordination Elena hadn't been able to manage for months. "That little lady's been holding back on us," Tommy Sullivan observed over breakfast one morning, savoring a perfectly flaky croissant that Elena had prepared from scratch. "I didn't think the cooking could get any better, but somehow it has." Jake smiled at the comment, pleased to see Elena's confidence returning along with her culinary capabilities. But his satisfaction was tempered by a growing uneasiness that had nothing to do with Elena's progress and everything to do with the phone call he'd received from Sheriff Hawkins the night before. "Jake, I got a call from the sheriff's office in Billings," Marcus had said, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "Someone's been asking questions about a woman matching Elena's description. Mexican-American, early 30s, might be working in food service." The Inquirer claimed to be a private investigator looking for a missing person, but the Billings sheriff got a bad feeling about the whole thing. What kind of bad feeling? The kind that comes from 30 years of separating legitimate cases. From abusive ex-husbands trying to track down women who had the good sense to run. Jake's blood had run cold at the implications. After 8 months of freedom, Elena's past was finally catching up to her. The question now was whether Jake and the ranch's security measures would be enough to keep her safe when it arrived. Jake didn't tell Elena about the phone call from Billings immediately. She'd been thriving for the past week, her confidence rebuilding with each successful meal prepared using her new adaptive equipment. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes since her arrival was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something that almost resembled contentment. Jake couldn't bring himself to shatter that fragile peace with news that her worst fears were materializing. Instead, he quietly doubled the ranch's security measures. The motion sensors along the main driveway were supplemented with additional cameras positioned at strategic points throughout the property. Jake instructed his ranch hands to report any unfamiliar vehicles or strangers asking questions, framing it as general security awareness rather than specific threat protection. He also began carrying his sidearm more frequently, a .45 caliber pistol he'd carried during his military service and kept locked in his office, safe since returning to civilian life. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in mid-November, when the first significant snowfall of the season blanketed the Double Creek Ranch in pristine white silence. Elena was preparing dinner for the crew, moving through the kitchen with newfound ease thanks to her adaptive tools. When Jake's security system chimed with an alert, someone was approaching the ranch. Jake pulled up, the camera feed on his laptop, his blood pressure spiking as he watched a dark sedan navigate the winding gravel driveway with the careful precision of someone unfamiliar with the terrain. The vehicle's windows were tinted too heavily to reveal its occupants, but Jake counted at least 2 figures in the front seats. "Elena," he called, trying to keep his voice calm and casual. "Could you step into my office for a moment?" She looked up from the stove where she was browning meat for a stew, her expression immediately shifting to concern. 8 months of running had honed Elena's instincts for danger, and she recognized the forced calm in Jake's voice. "What's wrong?" she asked, already moving toward the office despite her question. Jake gestured for her to look at the laptop screen, where the sedan was now visible pulling into the ranch's main parking area. 2 men emerged from the vehicle, both wearing expensive suits that looked absurdly out of place in the rural Montana setting. One was tall and thin with prematurely gray hair, while the other was shorter and stockier with the kind of build that suggested regular gym sessions focused on intimidation rather than fitness. Elena's reaction was immediate and visceral. All color drained from her face, and she gripped the edge of Jake's desk so tightly her knuckles went white. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, they found me. Do you recognize them?" Jake asked, though Elena's reaction had already provided the answer. "The tall one is Detective Raymond Cross. He's not really a detective. Marcus hired him to find me after I left Phoenix." Elena's voice was shaking, but she forced herself to continue watching the screen. "The other one is Luis Vega. He's Marcus's enforcer. The one who—" She gestured toward her damaged arm, unable to voice the details of what Lee Vega had done to her. Jake felt a surge of rage so intense it momentarily clouded his vision. The men on his security cameras weren't just Elena's past catching up to her, they were the architects of her trauma, the monsters who had systematically destroyed her body and spirit before she'd found the strength to escape. "They can't know you're here for certain," Jake said, forcing himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "If they had solid information, they would have brought more people or contacted local law enforcement with some kind of story." "It doesn't matter," Elena replied, her voice hollow with defeat. "They're here. Even if I run right now, they'll know they're on the right track. Marcus won't stop looking until he finds me." "Who is Marcus?" Elena's laugh was bitter and broken. "Marcus Rivera, my husband, former husband. I thought I was divorcing him when I filed the papers. But Marcus doesn't believe in divorce. He believes in ownership. The pieces clicked into place for Jake with sickening clarity. Elena wasn't just running from an abusive relationship. She was running from someone with the resources and connections to hunt her across multiple states using professional investigators and hired muscle. The kind of man who would view her escape as theft of his property rather than the exercise of basic human rights. On the security monitor, Cross and Vega were approaching the main house, their movements deliberate and confident. Jake watched Cross adjust something under his jacket, almost certainly a weapon, while Vega scanned the property with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to violence. "Elena, I need you to go upstairs to your apartment and lock the door," Jake said, moving toward the gun safe in the corner of his office. "Get in the bathroom and stay there until I come get you." "Jake, no. You don't understand what these men are capable of. Marcus pays them very well to be thorough in their work. And they don't understand what I'm capable of when someone threatens people under my protection," Jake replied, removing the .45 from the safe and checking its ammunition. "Elena, please, go upstairs and let me handle this." She hesitated, clearly torn between the instinct to run and the desire to protect Jake from dangers he might not fully comprehend. "They'll hurt you if you get in their way. Marcus doesn't leave loose ends, Elena." Jake's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Go, now." She went, but not before Jake saw the guilt and terror warring in her dark eyes. This was the scenario she'd been dreading for 8 months, the moment when her past would endanger innocent people who'd shown her kindness. Jake waited until he heard Elena's apartment door close and lock before positioning himself in the front hallway where he could see anyone approaching the main entrance. The ranch hands were still out checking the cattle in the far pastures, which meant Jake was alone to deal with Cross and Vega. Under normal circumstances, that might have been a disadvantage. Given the nature of the threat, Jake preferred it. This way, the knock on the front door was polite and professional, the kind of sound that might come from insurance salesmen or religious missionaries rather than hired thugs hunting a traumatized woman. Jake let them knock twice more before opening the door, using his considerable height and bulk to fill the doorframe completely. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Something I can help you with?" Cross smiled with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to talking his way past obstacles. "Good evening, sir. I'm Detective Cross, and this is my associate, Mr. Vega. We're looking for a missing person, and we have reason to believe she might be in this area." The man's credentials were professional quality forgeries, Jake realized, designed to intimidate, rather than deceive anyone with law enforcement experience. Cross was counting on rural Montanans being impressed by official-looking badges, rather than asking uncomfortable questions about jurisdiction and proper procedures. "Missing person?" Jake kept his expression mildly curious while his right hand remained positioned near his concealed weapon. "That sounds serious." "Very serious," Vega spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent and an undertone of barely controlled violence. "The woman has been missing for 8 months. Her family is very worried about her well-being." "I see. And what makes you think she might be in this area?" Cross produced a photograph from his jacket pocket, a picture of Elena that looked like it had been taken without her knowledge. She was smiling in the image, but Jake could see the tension around her eyes that suggested the photo had been captured during the time she was being abused. "Elena Martinez," Cross said, watching Jake's face carefully for any sign of recognition. 5 feet tall, Mexican-American, early 30s. She has experience in food service and might be working as a cook or waitress. "Can't say I've seen her," Jake replied without hesitation. "But we don't get many strangers out this way. You might want to check the restaurants and diners in town." "We've already done that," Vega said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "No one matching her description is working in any of the local establishments. Well, I'm sorry I can't help you." Jake began to close the door, but Cross stepped forward to block it. "Actually, Mr. Whitman, we were hoping you might let us take a look around your property. Sometimes missing persons seek employment at remote locations like this, thinking they'll be harder to find." The use of Jake's name wasn't accidental. Cross was letting him know they'd done their research, that they knew who he was and where he lived. It was an intimidation tactic designed to make Jake more cooperative and less likely to interfere with their search. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," Jake said, his voice hardening. "This is private property, and you don't have a warrant." "We're not law enforcement, Mr. Whitman," Cross replied smoothly. "We're private investigators working for Elena's family. Surely you can understand the husband's desire to find his missing wife." "I understand a lot of things," Jake said, "including the fact that women don't usually run away from loving husbands who are genuinely concerned about their well-being." The mask slipped from Cross's face for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath the professional facade. "Mr. Whitman, I'd hate for this to become unpleasant. We're simply trying to reunite a family. And I'm simply trying to protect my property and my privacy," Jake replied. "Now, unless you have legal authority to be here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Viga's hand moved toward his jacket, but Cross stopped him with a subtle gesture. They were testing Jake's resolve, trying to determine whether he was simply an uncooperative property owner or someone with specific knowledge of Elena's whereabouts. "Of course," Cross said, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "We wouldn't want to overstay our welcome. But Mr. Whitman, if you do happen to see Elena, I hope you'll understand that her husband is very anxious to have her home. He's a prominent businessman in Phoenix, and he has considerable resources at his disposal to ensure her safe return." The threat was barely veiled. Cross was telling Jake that Marcus Rivera had the money and connections to make life very difficult for anyone who interfered with his search for Elena. "I'll keep that in mind," Jake replied evenly. Cross handed Jake a business card with a phone number and nothing else. "In case you remember anything that might be helpful." Jake watched from his front window as the two men returned to their sedan and drove away, but he knew they weren't leaving the area permanently. They were regrouping, planning their next move, possibly calling Marcus Rivera to report that Jake Whitman was worth investigating further. He climbed the stairs to Elena's apartment and knocked softly on the door. "Elena, they're gone. For now." The door opened immediately, revealing Elena's tear-streaked face. She'd been crying silently while Jake confronted her hunters, probably convinced she was about to lose the first safe haven she'd found in 8 months. "What did they say?" she asked. "They asked if I'd seen you. I told them I hadn't. They wanted to search the property, and I refused." "They'll be back," Elena said with certainty. "Now that they know someone's protecting me, they'll assume I'm here. Marcus will send more people, or he'll come himself." Jake pulled Elena into a gentle embrace, careful not to put pressure on her damaged arm. "Elena, we're not going to let that happen. But I need you to tell me everything about Marcus Rivera, who he is, what he does, how he operates. If we're going to protect you from him, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Elena nodded against his chest, and Jake felt her make the decision to trust him completely with the truth about her past. "Marcus owns a chain of restaurants in Phoenix and Tucson. But that's just a legitimate business. Most of his money comes from other things: money laundering, drug trafficking, loan sharking. He has judges and police officers on his payroll. Which is why I couldn't go to the authorities when he started hurting me." "How long were you married?" 3 years. "The first year was wonderful. Marcus could be incredibly charming when he wanted to be. But once he thought he owned me completely, once I was isolated from my family and friends, he started showing his true nature." Elena pulled back to look at Jake directly. "The scars on my arm aren't from one incident. They're from months of systematic torture. Marcus would hurt me whenever I displeased him, but he was always careful to damage areas that would be hidden by clothing. Jake's jaw clenched as he absorbed the full scope of what Elena had endured. What finally made you decide to run? He started talking about having children, about how a baby would ensure I could never leave him. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. I realized that if I didn't escape then, I never would. So I took money from our joint account, filed for divorce, and disappeared. The divorce papers, did Marcus contest them? He never responded to them at all. In his mind, legal documents are just pieces of paper. I belong to him regardless of what any court says. Jake understood now why Elena had been so terrified. Why she'd spent 8 months moving from place to place without ever feeling safe. Marcus Rivera wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a criminal with the resources and connections to hunt her indefinitely. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Elena would always be alone and defenseless, that anyone who discovered her location would be easily intimidated into cooperation. He hadn't planned on Elena finding sanctuary with someone who had both the means and the determination to fight back. Jake spent that night developing a comprehensive defense strategy for the Double Creek Ranch. Elena's revelation about Marcus Rivera's criminal empire had transformed this from a domestic violence situation into something approaching a military operation. Rivera wasn't just a wealthy abuser with connections. He was a man who operated outside legal boundaries and had the resources to wage a prolonged campaign to reclaim what he considered his property. The ranch's isolated location, which Jake had always considered an asset, now presented both advantages and vulnerabilities. While the remote setting meant Rivera's men couldn't approach without being detected, it also meant help from law enforcement would be at least 20 minutes away under ideal conditions. In November Montana weather, with snow beginning to accumulate on the mountain passes, that response time could stretch to an hour or more. Jake's military experience kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation. The main house sat on elevated ground with excellent sight lines, providing defensive advantages. The ranch hand's bunkhouse could serve as a secondary position if the situation escalated. Most importantly, Jake's men were all experienced hunters and shooters who could be counted on in a crisis, even if they didn't fully understand the nature of the threat. The next morning, Jake called a meeting with his 12 ranch hands in the main barn. These were tough, practical men who'd chosen to work cattle in one of the harshest environments in the continental United States. They were accustomed to handling predators, extreme weather, and emergencies with minimal outside support. "Boys, we might have some trouble coming our way," Jake began, his straightforward approach earning immediate attention from the assembled men. "I can't go into all the details, but someone's been threatening Elena, and they might try to cause problems here at the ranch." Tommy Sullivan spoke up first, his weathered face creased with concern. "What kind of problems are we talking about, boss?" "The kind that might require us to protect someone who's under our roof," Jake replied carefully. "I'm not expecting anything to happen, but I want everyone to be aware that we might have unwelcome visitors." "These visitors?" asked Ranch Hand. "Pete Morrison. Are we talking about the law, or are we talking about the other kind?" "Definitely the other kind." The men exchanged glances that communicated volumes. They'd all worked for Jake long enough to trust his judgment completely, and several had military or law enforcement backgrounds that made them well suited for handling threats. More importantly, they'd all benefited from Elena's cooking and had developed protective feelings toward the quiet woman who'd transformed their meals from sustenance into genuine comfort. "What do you need from us?" Tommy asked. "Keep your eyes open for strangers on the property. Anyone you don't recognize, I want to know about immediately. Also, I'd appreciate it if you could make sure your personal firearms are clean and accessible, just in case." "Done," said Pete, speaking for the group. "That little lady's been taking good care of us. Time we return the favor." Jake felt a surge of gratitude for his men's loyalty, but also a growing weight of responsibility. Elena's safety now depended not just on his own actions, but on the willingness of 12 hardworking ranch hands to potentially risk their lives for someone they barely knew. Meanwhile, Elena was struggling with her own demons. The appearance of Cross and Vega had shattered the fragile sense of security she'd been building over the past month. She moved through the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, preparing meals with her new adaptive equipment, while her mind raced through escape scenarios and worst-case possibilities. "I should leave," she told Jake during breakfast preparation. "Before this gets worse. Before Marcus sends more people or decides to come himself." "And where?" Jake asked. "You've been running for 8 months, Elena. How much longer can you keep that up?" "As long as it takes to keep other people from getting hurt because of me." Jake studied Elena's face, seeing the guilt and self-blame that had become her constant companions. 8 months of running had convinced her that she was a burden, a source of danger for anyone kind enough to help her. The idea that she deserved protection and safety had been beaten out of her long before she'd escaped Phoenix. "Elena, look at me," Jake said gently. "You didn't create this situation. Marcus Rivera created it when he decided he owned another human being. You're not responsible for his choices, and you're not responsible for the consequences of those choices. But if I stay, you and your men could get hurt. Marcus doesn't care about collateral damage." "Neither do I," Jake replied with quiet intensity. "Elena, you're not alone anymore. You don't have to face this by yourself." That afternoon, Jake's security system detected another vehicle approaching the ranch. This time it was Sheriff Marcus Hawkins, driving his official patrol car up the winding driveway with the casual confidence of someone making a routine visit. Jake met him at the front door, noting the grim expression on his old friend's face. "More news from Billings?" "Worse than that," Marcus replied, following Jake into the kitchen where Elena was preparing dinner. "Elena, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." Elena's face went pale, but she nodded and gestured for both men to sit at the kitchen island. "Is it about the men who came yesterday?" "Among other things." "Elena, I did some research on Marcus Rivera after Jake told me about your situation. What I found is concerning enough that I think you need to consider witness protection." "Witness protection?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Marcus Rivera is currently under federal investigation for money laundering and racketeering. The FBI has been building a case against him for 2 years, but they haven't been able to get close enough to gather solid evidence. You lived with him for 3 years. You might know things that could help them put him away permanently." Jake felt a surge of hope at the sheriff's words. If Elena could help federal authorities build a case against Rivera, it might be the permanent solution to her problem. Rivera couldn't hunt her from federal prison, but Elena's reaction was immediate and terrified. "No, absolutely not. Marcus has people everywhere, judges, prosecutors, FBI agents. If I surface to testify against him, I'll be dead before the trial even starts. Elena, the Federal Witness Protection Program doesn't work against someone like Marcus," Elena interrupted. "He found me here in rural Montana after 8 months of careful hiding. Do you really think a government program will stop him?" Marcus Hawkins leaned forward, his expression serious but sympathetic. "Elena, I understand your fear. But running for the rest of your life isn't a sustainable solution. Rivera's not going to stop looking, and eventually he's going to find you. Again, then I'll run again. And how many more innocent people will get caught in the crossfire?" Jake asked quietly, "Elena, this isn't just about you anymore. Rivera's men know I've seen them, know I refuse to cooperate. Do you think they're going to let that slide?" Elena stared at Jake with dawning horror. She'd been so focused on protecting him and his men from immediate danger that she hadn't considered the long-term implications of Rivera's investigation of the Double Creek Ranch. By helping her, Jake had painted a target on himself and everyone associated with his operation. "Oh God," she whispered, I've destroyed everything." "You haven't destroyed anything," Jake said firmly. "But we need to start thinking strategically about how to end this permanently, instead of just reacting to immediate threats." Sheriff Hawkins pulled out a business card and slid it across the counter to Elena. "This is Agent Sarah Chun with the FBI. She's leading the investigation into Rivera's operation. I took the liberty of contacting her about your situation, and she's very interested in speaking with you." "You contacted the FBI without asking me?" Elena's voice rose in panic. "Elena, calm down. I didn't give them your location or any identifying information. I simply told them that a potential witness had surfaced and asked about protection options." Jake watched Elena struggle with the decision, seeing her weigh the terrifying prospect of facing Rivera in court against the impossible burden of running forever. The woman had been surviving on pure adrenaline and determination for 8 months, but even the strongest person had limits. "What exactly would they want from me?" Elena asked finally. "Information about Rivera's business operations, his associates, and his methods. You lived in his house, ate at his table, probably overheard conversations, and saw things that seemed innocent at the time, but might be crucial pieces of evidence. And in exchange, new identity, relocation to a secure location, financial support until you can establish yourself independently," Marcus replied. "Elena, it's a chance to have a real life again instead of constantly looking over your shoulder." Elena was quiet for several minutes, staring at Agent Chun's business card as if it might explode. Jake could see her internal struggle playing out across her features, the desperate desire for safety, warring against 8 months of learned paranoia. "There's something else," Sheriff Hawkins said reluctantly. "Agent Chun told me that Rivera's been expanding his search recently. He's hired additional investigators and put significant resources into finding you. She thinks he's getting pressure from his business associates who are concerned about what you might know." "Pressure how?" "The kind of pressure that makes a man desperate enough to take bigger risks. Elena, Rivera's not just looking for you because he misses his wife. He's looking for you because you represent a potential threat to his entire operation." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd assumed Marcus was hunting her out of possessive anger, the inability to accept that she'd escaped his control. The possibility that she was being hunted because she possessed information valuable enough to destroy his criminal empire added an entirely new dimension of danger to her situation. "I don't know anything useful," she protested. "I was just his wife. He didn't discuss business with me. People like Rivera can't completely separate their business and personal lives," Jake said. "You probably know more than you realize." Elena stood abruptly and began pacing the kitchen, her right hand running through her hair while her damaged left arm remained pressed against her side. The decision she was being asked to make would determine not just her own future, but potentially the fates of Jake and his ranch hands who'd shown her kindness. "If I contact this FBI agent," Elena said slowly, "if I agree to cooperate with their investigation, what happens to everyone here? Marcus will assume Jake and his men helped me, that they have information about his operation. That's a legitimate concern," Sheriff Hawkins admitted. "But Elena, Rivera's already suspicious of this location. Staying silent isn't going to make you or anyone else safer at this point." Jake watched Elena wrestle with the decision, understanding that she was being forced to choose between 2 equally terrifying options: contact the FBI and risk exposing herself to the very system that had failed to protect her in Phoenix, or continue running and potentially endanger everyone who'd shown her kindness. "There's a third option," Jake said quietly, the idea forming as he spoke. "We make Rivera come to us, but on our terms with law enforcement backup and witnesses." Both Elena and Sheriff Hawkins stared at Jake as if he'd suggested something completely insane. "Hear me out," Jake continued. "Rivera's going to keep hunting Elena regardless of what we do. His men know she's probably here, and they're going to keep applying pressure until they get what they want. But what if we controlled the circumstances of that confrontation? Jake, what are you suggesting? Elena asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. I'm suggesting we stop running and start fighting back. But intelligently, with law enforcement support and enough evidence to ensure Rivera goes to prison for the rest of his life. Sheriff Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his experienced cop instincts clearly warring with his concern for civilian safety. Jake, that's an incredibly dangerous plan. More dangerous than letting Elena spend the rest of her life running from a man with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries? Jake asked. More dangerous than pretending Rivera's going to give up and go home? Elena stopped pacing and turned to face both men, her expression showing the first spark of hope Jake had seen from her since Cross and Viga's visit. You're talking about setting a trap. I'm talking about ending this permanently, Jake replied. Elena, you deserve better than a life spent looking over your shoulder. We all do. The FBI meeting took place 3 days later in the conference room of the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, chosen for its secure location and recording capabilities. Agent Sarah Chun arrived from Billings with a partner, Agent David Rodriguez, both carrying thick files that suggested the federal investigation into Marcus Rivera had been ongoing far longer than Sheriff Hawkins had initially indicated. Elena sat between Jake and her newly appointed attorney, a public defender named Margaret Walsh, who specialized in federal witness cases. Elena had insisted she couldn't afford legal representation, but Jake had quietly arranged for Walsh's services, understanding that Elena needed professional advocacy to navigate the complex world of federal cooperation agreements. Agent Chun was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the kind of controlled intensity that suggested years of dealing with dangerous criminals. She opened the meeting by spreading photographs across the conference table, surveillance images of Marcus Rivera, his associates, and various business operations that formed the backbone of his criminal enterprise. Mrs. Rivera, Agent Chun began, then caught herself. I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez. We've been investigating your husband's organization for 3 years, but we've had difficulty penetrating his inner circle. Most of his legitimate employees have no knowledge of the criminal activities, and his criminal associates are too well compensated and too frightened to cooperate with federal authorities. Elena studied the photographs with obvious discomfort, pointing to several faces she recognized. This is Carlos Mendez, Marcus's accountant. This one is Sofia Delgado. She manages the restaurant operations but also handles communications for the other businesses. And this, Alana's voice dropped to a whisper as she indicated a particularly menacing-looking man, is Antonio Vasquez. He's Marcus's second in command for everything that isn't restaurants. What can you tell us about Antonio? Agent Rodriguez asked, making notes on a legal pad. He came to the house regularly for meetings with Marcus. Always late at night, always. In the study with the door closed. But the house has an intercom system, and Marcus sometimes forgot to turn it off when he was talking business. Agent Chun leaned forward, her excitement carefully controlled. What kind of things did you overhear? Elena glanced at her attorney, who nodded encouragingly. Numbers, mostly. Percentages, delivery schedules, payments that needed to be made to specific people. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but looking back ... Can you be more specific about the numbers? Marcus would talk about cleaning money through the restaurants. 20% seemed to be the standard fee for moving money from one account to another. There were regular payments to someone called the judge, $5,000 every month, and payments to several police officers, though I only heard first names. Agent Chun and Rodriguez exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Elena's casual observations from the intercom system were providing details that 3 years of surveillance had failed to capture. Ms. Martinez, these conversations you overheard, Do you remember specific dates or circumstances that might help us correlate them with other evidence? Elena's damaged hand unconsciously moved to her left arm, hidden beneath her long-sleeved shirt. Some of them, yes. Marcus was always more talkative when he'd been drinking, and he drank heavily on Sundays after his meetings with the restaurant. Managers, I remember specific conversations because ... She hesitated, glancing at Jake before continuing. Because those were often the nights when he would hurt me. The business stress made him violent, so I learned to pay attention to his moods and the topics that triggered his anger. Jake's hands clenched into fists under the conference table, but he forced himself to remain silent. Elena needed to tell her story in her own way, without his protective instincts interfering with the process. Elena, Margaret Walsh interjected. You don't have to provide specific details about the abuse unless they're directly relevant to the criminal investigation. Actually, they might be more relevant than you think, Agent Chun said carefully. Ms. Martinez, did Marcus ever hurt you in connection with business disputes or problems? Elena's face went pale, but she nodded. When the federal investigation started 2 years ago, Marcus became paranoid about everyone around him. He was convinced someone in his organization was feeding information to law enforcement. He started ... testing people's loyalty. Testing? How? He would tell different people different pieces of false information, then wait to see if any of it showed up in federal search warrants or investigation activities. And he would question me constantly about who I'd talked to, what I'd seen, whether I'd noticed anything unusual. Elena rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the twisted scars that covered her arm from wrist to elbow. Jake had seen them before, but the FBI agent's shocked reactions reminded him of his own initial horror at the systematic nature of the damage. This happened over the course of 6 months, Elena continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Every time Marcus thought someone in his organization might be cooperating with federal authorities, he would take his frustration out on me. He said I was the only person he could trust completely, but he needed to make sure I understood the consequences of betrayal. Agent Rodriguez stopped taking notes, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. Ms. Martinez, we're going to need detailed statements about these incidents, including dates and circumstances. This constitutes federal civil rights violations in addition to the racketeering charges. Will those statements be enough to convict him? Elena asked. Combined with the financial information you can provide and corroborating evidence we've already gathered, yes. We believe we can build a case that will result in life imprisonment for Marcus Rivera. Elena was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. Testifying against Marcus wouldn't just end his freedom, it would destroy the criminal empire that had made him wealthy and powerful while terrorizing her for 3 years. What about protection for Jake and his men? Elena asked finally. Marcus will assume they helped me, that they know about his operations. That's something we need to discuss, Agent Chun admitted. Mr. Whitman, you and your employees would be eligible for witness protection services, but that would mean leaving your ranch and starting over with new identities. Jake shook his head immediately. That's not happening. This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. I'm not abandoning it because some criminal from Phoenix thinks he can intimidate me. Mr. Whitman, with respect, you may not understand the level of resources Marcus Rivera can bring to bear against perceived threats. Agent Chun, with respect, you may not understand the level of resources I can bring to bear against people who threaten my family, Jake replied. This ranch employs 12 men who've been handling predators and emergencies for years. We're not helpless civilians. Elena looked between Jake and the FBI agents, seeing the fundamental disconnect between federal law enforcement's desire to control the situation and Jake's refusal to be relocated like a piece on a chessboard. There's another option, Elena said slowly. What if we used the ranch as the location for Rivera's arrest? Both FBI agents stared at her as if she'd suggested something completely insane. "Explain that," Agent Chun said carefully. "Marcus is going to come here eventually. His men have already been to the ranch, and they know I'm probably here. Instead of waiting for him to choose the time and circumstances, what if we controlled when and how that confrontation happened?" Agent Rodriguez frowned. "Ms. Martinez, that would put you in incredible danger." "I'm already in incredible danger," Elena replied. "At least this way, I'd have FBI protection and backup instead of just hoping Marcus never finds me." Jake felt a surge of pride at Elena's courage, even as his protective instincts screamed against putting her at additional risk. It would also mean we could gather evidence of federal crimes in real time: kidnapping, interstate transportation for criminal purposes, conspiracy, and weapons charges, assault, civil rights violations, Agent Chun added, her tactical mind clearly working through the possibilities. "Mr. Whitman, your ranch is isolated enough that we could position significant backup without being detected." Margaret Walsh held up a hand to interrupt the planning session. "Before we go any further with this idea, I need to discuss the legal implications with my client privately." "Elena, you're talking about deliberately putting yourself in harm's way to gather evidence against a man who's already demonstrated he's willing to torture you. That's not a decision to make lightly." "Attorney Walsh is right," Elena said. "But I need all of you to understand something. I've been running for 8 months, and I'm tired. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of putting other people in danger just by existing. If there's a way to end this permanently, to make sure Marcus can never hurt me or anyone else again, I want to take it." Jake reached over and gently took Elena's right hand in his massive one. "Elena, you don't have to make this decision right now, and you don't have to make it alone." "Actually, I do," Elena replied, but she didn't pull her hand away from Jake's. "This is my life, my choice, and I choose to stop running." Agent Chun opened another file and spread additional documents across the table. "If we're going to seriously consider this operation, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. These are financial records we've obtained through various investigative methods. Marcus Rivera's organization moves approximately $50 million annually through money laundering operations. He employs at least 30 people in various criminal capacities, and he has documented connections to Mexican cartel operations." "Meaning?" Jake asked. "Meaning he has access to military-grade weapons, explosives, and personnel trained in combat operations. Mr. Whitman, if Rivera decides to assault your ranch, it won't be 2 men in suits asking polite questions. It will be a small army equipped for warfare." Elena's face went white at the description, but her voice remained steady. "Then we make sure the FBI is ready for a small army." Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes before responding. "Ms. Martinez, a federal operation of that scope would require weeks of planning, significant personnel resources, and approval from the highest levels of the Bureau. It's not something we could arrange quickly or quietly." "How long?" Elena asked. "Minimum 2 weeks to get the necessary approvals and position the required personnel. Probably closer to a month to do it properly." Jake felt Elena's hand tighten in his timeline. A month was an eternity when Marcus Rivera's men were already investigating the Double Creek Ranch. There was no guarantee that Rivera would wait for federal law enforcement to arrange the perfect sting operation. "There's another consideration," Agent Chun said reluctantly. "Intelligence suggests that Rivera is planning to conclude his search for you within the next 2 weeks. Our sources indicate he's under pressure from business associates to resolve what they consider a security threat." "Security threat?" "You." "Ms. Martinez, Rivera's criminal associates have become aware that his missing wife might possess information valuable to federal authorities. They're concerned that your continued freedom represents an unacceptable risk to their operations." Elena laughed bitterly. So Marcus isn't just hunting me because he thinks he owns me. He's hunting me because his business partners think I'm a liability. That's correct. And that pressure might make him careless enough to expose himself to federal arrest. But it also makes him significantly more dangerous to you personally. Jake studied the FBI agents' faces, reading the subtext of their carefully worded warnings. The federal government wanted Elena's cooperation, but they couldn't guarantee her safety during the time it would take to arrange proper protection. She was being asked to trust a system that had already failed to protect her once. What if we split the difference? Jake asked. What if Elena agrees to cooperate with the federal investigation, but we arrange our own security for the ranch, while you're getting approvals and positioning personnel? Mr. Whitman, we can't officially sanction civilian law enforcement actions. I'm not asking for official sanction. I'm asking for a timeline. How long before you can provide adequate federal protection for Elena and everyone else Rivera might target? Agent Chun consulted with her partner in whispered conference before responding. 3 weeks minimum. Possibly longer depending on bureaucratic approval processes. Elena stood abruptly, her decision made. Then we plan for 3 weeks. Jake, if you're willing to help protect me that long, I'll cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Agent Chun, I'll provide detailed statements about everything I saw and heard during my marriage to Marcus Rivera. But I'm not going into hiding again, and I'm not abandoning the people who've shown me kindness. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Elena's commitment settled over everyone present. She was choosing to make her stand at the Double Creek Ranch with Jake and his men as her protection against one of the Southwest's most dangerous criminal organizations. Elena, Margaret Walsh said quietly, you're essentially declaring war on your ex-husband. No, Elena replied, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. I'm declaring independence. The transformation of the Double Creek Ranch began immediately after Elena's declaration of independence. What had been a working cattle operation became a fortress, with Jake coordinating defensive preparations while Elena spent hours each day providing detailed statements to Agent Chun via secure video calls. Jake's military background proved invaluable as he assessed the ranch's tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. The main house's elevated position provided excellent observation points, while the surrounding terrain offered both cover and concealment opportunities. The ranch's isolation, which had initially seemed like a liability, now worked in their favor. Any approaching vehicles would be visible from miles away. The first major change was the establishment of a communication center in Jake's office. Agent Chun had provided encrypted satellite phones and radio equipment that allowed direct contact with FBI command centers in Billings and Salt Lake City. A federal technical team had also upgraded the ranch's internet connectivity, ensuring that Elena's video testimonies could be transmitted securely to federal prosecutors in real time. Elena's daily routine shifted dramatically as she balanced her cooking responsibilities with her new role as a federal witness. Each morning, she would prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, then spend 3 to 4 hours in detailed interviews with FBI personnel. The sessions were emotionally exhausting, requiring her to relive years of abuse while simultaneously providing the technical details that federal prosecutors needed to build their case. Tell me about the Sunday night meetings Marcus held with his restaurant managers, Agent Chun requested during one particularly intense session. You mentioned these meetings often preceded incidents of domestic violence. Elena sat at Jake's desk, her adaptive kitchen equipment nearby as a reminder of how far she'd come since arriving at the ranch. Marcus would meet with the managers every Sunday evening at 8 o'clock. They would report weekly revenues from each location, but they would also provide updates on other activities. What kind of other activities? Cash transactions that didn't appear in the official books. Payments to various individuals whose names I didn't recognize. and discussions about cleaning schedules, which I now understand referred to money laundering operations. Elena's memory for financial details proved remarkably accurate, providing federal investigators with specific dates, amounts, and participant names that corroborated evidence they'd been gathering through other means. Her position as Marcus's wife had given her access to information that even undercover federal agents hadn't been able to obtain. Meanwhile, Jake was transforming his ranch hands into a defensive militia. These were already tough, practical men, but Jake's military experience allowed him to organize them into an effective security force. Tommy Sullivan, who had served as a Marine in Afghanistan, became Jake's second-in-command for security operations. Pete Morrison, with his law enforcement background, took responsibility for communications and liaison with federal authorities. "Boys, I need you to understand what we're potentially dealing with," Jake explained during a security briefing in the ranch's main barn. "Marcus Rivera isn't just an abusive husband. He's a criminal with access to military weapons and personnel trained for combat operations." "Boss, exactly how many people are we talking about?" asked ranch hand Bill Crawford, a former Army sergeant who'd been working cattle for Jake for 5 years. "FBI estimates Rivera could deploy up to 20 armed personnel if he decides to make a serious assault on the ranch. They would likely be equipped with automatic weapons, body armor, and possibly explosives." The ranch hands absorbed this information with the calm professionalism of men accustomed to handling dangerous situations. Working cattle in Montana wilderness meant dealing with grizzly bears, mountain lions, and severe weather conditions that could turn lethal without warning. The threat of armed criminals was simply another type of predator to be managed and defeated. "What about the law?" Tommy asked. "If Rivera's men come here with that kind of firepower, we're talking about a military assault, not a domestic dispute." "Sheriff Hawkins has coordinated with state and federal authorities," Jake replied. "If Rivera makes his move, we'll have backup. But the ranch's location means we'll be on our own for at least 20 minutes, possibly longer depending on weather conditions." Jake had spent considerable resources upgrading the ranch's defensive capabilities. Military-grade night vision equipment, encrypted communications gear, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged firefight. He'd also arranged for the temporary relocation of the ranch's cattle to safer pastures, reducing the animals' exposure to potential violence while eliminating one of Rivera's possible leverage points. The most significant change was the construction of a secure bunker beneath the main house's basement. Jake had hired a discreet construction crew to excavate and reinforce an underground chamber capable of protecting Elena and essential personnel during an assault. The bunker included independent communications equipment, emergency supplies, and a concealed escape tunnel that emerged in the barn. Nearly 200 yards away, Elena watched these preparations with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that was painful to witness. "Jake, you've turned your home into a military installation because of me," she said one evening as they reviewed the day's security reports. "Elena, I've improved my property's security because dangerous people are threatening someone under my protection," Jake replied. "This isn't about you personally. It's about the principle that people have the right to be safe in their homes. But the expense, the disruption to your business operations... Elena, look at me." Jake's voice carried the authority that had made him an effective military leader. "You're not a burden. You're family. And family protects family, regardless of the cost." Elena's eyes filled with tears at Jake's declaration, but they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. For the first time in years, she was experiencing what it felt like to be valued and protected rather than owned and controlled. The ranch's defensive preparations were tested 1 week into the 3-week timeline when Jake's security system detected vehicles approaching at 3 in the morning. The motion sensors along the main driveway triggered alerts that woke everyone in the main house and bunkhouse simultaneously docked. Jake reached the communication center within 90 seconds, pulling up camera feeds that showed two black SUVs moving slowly up the gravel driveway with their headlights extinguished. Even in the infrared camera view, Jake could see that both vehicles were heavily loaded with passengers. "Tommy, Pete, get to positions," Jake radioed to his men. "Elena, get to the bunker now." Elena had practiced this drill dozens of times over the past week, but the reality of an actual threat made her movements clumsy and panicked. Jake helped her down the concealed staircase to the underground chamber, ensuring she had access to communications equipment before sealing the entrance. "Stay here until I give the all clear," Jake instructed. "If something happens to me, contact Agent Chun immediately and follow the escape tunnel to the barn." The approaching vehicle stopped approximately half a mile from the main house, just outside the range of Jake's most powerful spotlights. Through night vision scopes, Jake and his men could see armed figures deploying from both SUVs and taking positions among the scattered boulders and trees that dotted the ranch's landscape. "Count at least 12 hostiles," Tommy reported via radio. "All appear to be carrying assault rifles." Jake contacted Sheriff Hawkins and Agent Chun simultaneously, providing GPS coordinates and tactical assessments of the developing situation. Federal backup was already en route, but the nearest units were still 40 minutes away under optimal conditions. "Mr. Whitman," came an electronically amplified voice from the direction of the SUVs. "We know Elena Martinez is on your property. Send her out, and no one gets hurt." Jake recognized the voice as belonging to Detective Cross, the same man who'd posed as a private investigator during the initial visit to the ranch. But Cross was no longer maintaining the pretense of being a legitimate law enforcement officer. "This is private property," Jake shouted back, using his own electronic amplification system. "You're trespassing, and law enforcement has been notified. Mr. Whitman, Elena's husband, just wants to talk to her. She's been missing for 8 months, and her family is worried about her." The lie was so blatant that Jake felt his anger flare despite the tactical situation's seriousness. Rivera's men were still trying to maintain the fiction that this was a legitimate family reunification rather than an attempted kidnapping of a federal witness. "Elena Martinez has made it clear she doesn't want to see her husband," Jake replied. "If Rivera wants to communicate with her, he can do it through attorneys and proper legal channels." The response was immediate and violent. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, shattering windows in the main house and sending rounds whistling through the darkness. Jake and his men returned fire from prepared positions, their hunting rifles and tactical weapons, creating a devastating crossfire that forced Rivera's men to seek better cover. The firefight continued for nearly 15 minutes, with both sides exchanging sporadic gunfire while maneuvering for tactical advantage. Jake's men had the benefits of elevation, prepared positions, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Rivera's men had superior numbers and firepower, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who knew every rock and tree on the property. The tide turned when Pete Morrison managed to disable one of the SUVs with a well-placed shot into its engine block. The explosion of the vehicle's gas tank illuminated the battlefield, revealing the positions of several attackers who had been concealed in darkness. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The amplified command came from the main driveway, where a convoy of FBI vehicles was approaching with sirens blaring and spotlights blazing. Rivera's men found themselves caught between Jake's defensive positions and the arriving federal backup. Some attempted to surrender, while others tried to escape through the rugged terrain surrounding the ranch. The battle ended as abruptly as it had begun, with federal agents securing the area and providing medical attention to wounded personnel on both sides. 3 of Rivera's men had been killed in the firefight, while 5 others were captured with serious injuries. 2 of Jake's ranch hands had suffered minor wounds, But none of the defenders had been seriously hurt. Jake descended to the bunker to retrieve Elena, finding her huddled in the corner with tears streaming down her face. She'd heard every gunshot, every explosion, every shout during the 15-minute battle that had determined her fate. "Is it over?" she whispered. "This part is over," Jake replied gently. But Elena, Marcus Rivera wasn't here. This was just his advance team. Elena's face went white as the implications sank in. Rivera had sent 12 armed men to assault the ranch, but he'd remained safely in Phoenix while others did his dirty work. The night's violence had been merely a probing attack, designed to test the ranch's defenses and eliminate Elena's protection before Rivera made his final move. "He'll send more people," Elena said with certainty. "Marcus doesn't give up, and he doesn't accept defeat." Agent Chun arrived at the ranch within 2 hours of the firefight's conclusion, bringing additional federal personnel and equipment for processing the crime scene. The captured attackers were being interrogated, but early reports suggested they were hired mercenaries rather than Rivera's regular employees. "Ms. Martinez, this assault represents multiple federal crimes: interstate transportation for criminal purposes, attempted kidnapping, assault on a federal witness," Agent Chun explained as Elena gave her statement about the night's events. "We now have enough evidence to arrest Marcus Rivera immediately, but you haven't arrested him yet," Elena observed. "Rivera left Phoenix yesterday morning. Our surveillance teams lost track of him somewhere in southern Colorado. We believe he's traveling to Montana personally to oversee the next attempt to capture you." Jake felt ice in his veins at the news. Marcus Rivera was no longer directing operations from a safe distance. He was coming to Montana himself, which meant the next assault on the Double Creek Ranch would be led by a man with nothing left to lose and the resources to wage a small war. "How long before he gets here?" Jake asked, based on his last known position and likely travel routes. "Probably within the next 48 hours. Elena stood slowly, her face showing a resolve that hadn't been there before the night's violence. "Then we have 48 hours to prepare for the final confrontation." The 48-hour preparation period transformed the Double Creek Ranch into something resembling a military forward operating base. Agent Chun had secured emergency authorization to position a full FBI tactical team on the property, while Jake coordinated with his ranch hands to establish overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions throughout the compound. Elena spent those crucial hours completing her testimony via secure video link to federal prosecutors in Phoenix, Washington, and Salt Lake City. Her detailed knowledge of Marcus Rivera's criminal operations had provided the foundation for a comprehensive federal indictment that would ensure life imprisonment if Rivera could be taken alive. But Elena harbored no illusions about her ex-husband's intentions. Marcus was coming to Montana to eliminate her permanently, not to negotiate or surrender. "The financial records you've provided match transactions we've been monitoring for 2 years," Agent Chun told Elena during their final evidence review session. "Your testimony about the Sunday night meetings has allowed us to identify previously unknown associates and money laundering routes. Will it be enough to convict him?" Elena asked, though both women knew conviction required Rivera to survive. "The coming confrontation, more than enough. Elena, you've provided evidence of crimes carrying mandatory life sentences under federal racketeering statutes. If we can arrest Marcus Rivera alive, he'll never see freedom again." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Agent Chun, you need to understand something about Marcus. He's not coming here to kidnap me or force me to return to Phoenix. He's coming here to kill me and everyone who helped me. Marcus would rather destroy everything than allow anyone to escape his control." The FBI agent studied Elena's face, seeing the certainty of someone who'd lived with a dangerous predator for 3 years. "Elena, we're prepared for that possibility. The tactical team positioned here has dealt with heavily armed criminal organizations before. Have they dealt with someone who has unlimited financial resources and no concern for collateral damage? Agent Chun was quiet for a moment, acknowledging the validity of Elena's concern. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a criminal. He was a man whose entire world was collapsing, who had nothing left to lose and the means to inflict tremendous damage. In his final act of revenge, meanwhile, Jake was conducting final defensive preparations with the grim efficiency of someone who'd commanded troops in combat zones. The ranch hands had been positioned in concealed firing positions throughout the property, with each man assigned specific fields of responsibility and predetermined fallback routes. The main house had been reinforced with additional barricades, while the bunker beneath the basement had been stocked with enough supplies to sustain Elena and essential personnel for several days if necessary. "Tommy, what's the status of the perimeter sensors?" Jake asked during a final security briefing. "All operational, boss. We've got motion detection covering every approach route within 2 miles of the main house. Thermal imaging is online, and we've established redundant communications to all positions." Pete Morrison provided the liaison update with federal authorities. FBI tactical teams are positioned in the barn and secondary outbuildings. The sheriff's department has roadblocks established on all major routes into the area. State Patrol is providing air support with helicopter units stationed in Kalispell. Jake nodded, satisfied that they'd done everything possible to prepare for Rivera's assault. But he also understood that preparation could only go so far when facing an opponent with superior numbers, firepower, and the desperation of someone fighting for his life. "One more thing," Jake said to his assembled men. "If this goes bad, if Rivera's people overrun our positions, your primary responsibility is to yourselves and your families. Elena and I knew the risks when we decided to make our stand here. Don't get yourself killed trying to be heroes." The ranch hands exchanged glances that communicated their response without words. These were men who'd worked for Jake for years, who'd benefited from Elena's cooking and kindness, who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Rivera's arrival was detected at dawn on the 3rd day, when perimeter sensors registered a convoy of vehicles approaching from 3 different directions simultaneously. Jake's security cameras captured images of at least 30 armed personnel deploying from military-style vehicles, all wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons that belonged in war zones rather than domestic law enforcement operations. "This is it," Jake announced over the ranch's communication system. "All personnel to assigned positions. Elena, get to the bunker immediately." But Elena had made a decision during the long night of waiting that surprised everyone, including herself. "Jake, I'm not hiding in the bunker this time. Elena, we discussed this. The bunker is the safest place on the ranch. The safest place for me is wherever you can see me and protect me," Elena replied with quiet determination. "If Marcus breaks through your defenses, that bunker becomes a tomb. I'd rather face him standing up." Jake wanted to argue, but he recognized the resolve in Elena's voice. She'd spent 8 months running from Marcus Rivera, and she was done hiding. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Elena was determined to face it on her own terms. Rivera's assault began with a coordinated attack on 3 fronts, designed to overwhelm the ranch's defenses through sheer firepower and numbers. Automatic weapons fire erupted from positions throughout the property as Rivera's mercenaries attempted to advance on the main house under cover of suppressing fire. But Jake's defensive strategy had anticipated exactly this type of assault, rather than trying to hold fixed positions against superior numbers. The ranch hands employed mobile tactics that used their knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. They would engage Rivera's men from concealed positions, inflict casualties, then withdraw to secondary positions before the enemy could concentrate fire on their locations. The FBI tactical team provided the backbone of the defense, using their superior training and equipment to coordinate the ranch hands' efforts into a cohesive defensive plan. Federal snipers positioned in the barn's hayloft began systematically eliminating Rivera's advance personnel, while tactical teams positioned in the outbuildings prevented the attackers from establishing secure firing positions. "Jake, we've got vehicles approaching from the north pasture," Tommy radioed from his position near the equipment shed. "Looks like Rivera's trying to flank our main defensive line." Jake adjusted his own position to counter the flanking attempt, leaving Elena in the main house under the protection of 2 FBI agents. Through the reinforced windows, he could see muzzle flashes throughout the property as the battle intensified. Turning point came when Rivera himself finally revealed his position. Jake caught sight of a familiar figure directing operations from behind one of the disabled vehicles, Marcus Rivera, shouting orders to his mercenaries while remaining safely behind cover. Even in the chaos of combat, Jake could see that Rivera was a physically small man whose power came from wealth and intimidation rather than personal courage. "Agent Chun, I have eyes on Rivera," Jake radioed to the FBI command position. "He's approximately 200 yards southeast of the main house, behind the burned-out SUV from the first attack. Copy that. Tactical team is moving to intercept." But Rivera had seen the federal agents advancing on his position. Instead of attempting to escape or surrender, he began moving directly toward the main house with a small group of his most loyal mercenaries. Jake realized with growing horror that Rivera was making a final desperate attempt to reach Elena personally. "All units, Rivera is moving on the main house," Jake announced over the communications system. "Converge on the building immediately." Jake sprinted back toward the main house, arriving just as Rivera's group breached the reinforced front door using explosive charges. The blast shattered windows throughout the first floor and filled the interior with smoke and debris. Through the chaos, Jake could hear Rivera's voice calling for Elena with the possessive fury of someone reclaiming stolen property. "Elena, I know you're here. Come out and face me like the wife you swore to be." Jake entered the smoke-filled house through the kitchen entrance, moving toward Elena's last known position while trying to locate Rivera and his remaining men. The FBI agents assigned to protect Elena were unconscious near the staircase, victims of the explosive breach that had caught them by surprise. "Elena." Rivera's voice was closer now, filled with the rage of someone whose carefully constructed world had been destroyed by his victim's escape. 3 years I gave you. 3 years of my protection, my money, my love. And this is how you repay me? Jake found Elena barricaded behind the overturned dining room table, her right hand gripping a kitchen knife, while her damaged left arm hung uselessly at her side. Rivera was advancing on her position with a pistol drawn, his face twisted with the kind of fury that made rational thought impossible. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "It's over. The FBI has everything. Financial records, witness testimony, evidence of all your crimes. Even if you kill me, you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison." "Then I have nothing left to lose," Rivera replied, raising his weapon. Jake's shot took Rivera center mass, the impact of the .45 caliber round spinning him around and sending his pistol skittering across the debris-covered floor. Rivera collapsed against the wall, his expensive suit darkening with blood as he stared at Jake with disbelief and rage. "You don't understand," Rivera gasped, trying to reach his fallen weapon. "She belongs to me. Elena is mine." "Elena belongs to herself," Jake replied, keeping his weapon trained on the dying man. "She always has." Rivera's remaining mercenaries had been eliminated or captured by the converging FBI tactical teams, leaving the ranch house in an eerie silence broken only by Rivera's labored breathing. Agent Chun entered through the damaged front door, surveying the scene with professional calm. "Elena, are you hurt?" she asked. Elena shook her head, unable to speak as the reality of her freedom finally settled over her. Marcus Rivera, the man who'd controlled and terrorized her for years, was dying on the floor of the Montana ranch that had become her sanctuary. "It's over," Jake said gently, helping Elena to her feet. "Elena, it's really over. Rivera died before the paramedics could stabilize him for transport." His final words a curse directed at Elena for having the audacity to escape his control. With his death, the criminal organization that had hunted her across multiple states collapsed, leaving Elena free to rebuild her life without fear. The aftermath of the battle was swift and decisive. Rivera's surviving mercenaries were taken into federal custody, facing charges that would ensure decades in prison. The financial evidence Elena had provided led to the dismantling of Rivera's entire criminal empire, with dozens of arrests and asset forfeitures that crippled organized crime operations throughout the Southwest. Elena stood on the front porch of the Double Creek Ranch as federal investigators processed the crime scene, watching the sun set over the Montana mountains that had witnessed her final confrontation with the past. Jake stood beside her, his presence a reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now you get to find out what it's like to live without fear," Jake replied. "Now you get to discover who Elena Martinez really is when she's not running or hiding." Elena smiled for the first time since Rivera's arrival, feeling the weight of 8 months of terror finally lifting from her shoulders. The scars on her left arm would always remind her of what she'd survived, but they would also remind her of her own strength and resilience. The Double Creek Ranch had given her more than sanctuary. It had given her the chance to fight back and win. 6 months after Marcus Rivera's death, Elena Martinez stood in the kitchen of the Double Creek Ranch, no longer hiding her scars beneath oversized clothing. The adaptive equipment that had once been a necessity for basic survival had evolved into tools of culinary artistry, allowing her to create elaborate meals that had transformed the ranch's reputation throughout the region. The federal trials resulting from Rivera's criminal empire had concluded with unprecedented success for prosecutors. Elena's testimony, delivered via secure video link from the ranch, had provided the foundation for convictions that dismantled an organization responsible for laundering over $200 million annually. 37 individuals received federal prison sentences, including corrupt officials who'd enabled Rivera's operations for years. "The Justice Department wants to present you with a commendation for your cooperation in the investigation," Agent Chun explained during her final visit to the ranch. "Your testimony resulted in the largest organized crime prosecution in Arizona's history." Elena accepted the recognition with quiet grace, but her focus had shifted entirely to building the future she'd never imagined possible. The woman who'd arrived at the Double Creek Ranch with nothing but a damaged arm and a lifetime of trauma had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Jake's ranch hands had become something more than employees during the months of preparation and battle. They'd become family. Tommy Sullivan had taken over much of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Jake to spend time helping Elena develop plans for expanding the ranch's hospitality services. Pete Morrison had accepted a position with the county sheriff's department, using his experience from the Rivera confrontation to improve rural law enforcement capabilities. The most significant change was Elena's decision to establish a foundation, providing assistance to domestic violence survivors seeking to rebuild their lives. Using a portion of the federal reward money she'd received for her cooperation in the Rivera investigation, Elena created safe houses and job training programs, specifically designed for women escaping abusive relationships. "Every woman deserves the chance I had," Elena explained to a group of social workers visiting the ranch. "The chance to discover who she really is when she's not afraid." The foundation's first safe house was located on property adjacent to the Double Creek Ranch, staffed by counselors and security personnel trained to deal with high-risk situations. Elena's own experience had taught her that escaping an abusive relationship was only the beginning of a much longer journey toward healing and independence. Jake had initially worried that Elena's foundation work might interfere with her recovery, forcing her to constantly revisit traumatic experiences. Instead, he discovered that helping other survivors had accelerated Elena's own healing process, giving her a sense of purpose that transcended her personal suffering. "I spent 8 months running from my past," Elena told a group of domestic violence counselors during a training session. "But I've learned that healing doesn't come from forgetting what happened. It comes from using what happened to help others." The ranch itself had been restored to its original function, though enhanced security measures remained in place. The bunker beneath the main house had been converted into a wine cellar, while the communications equipment Jake had installed during the crisis now served the foundation's operations. Elena's relationship with Jake had evolved naturally from protector and protected to genuine partnership. The giant rancher who'd risked everything to defend a woman he barely knew had discovered that Elena's courage and determination matched his own. Their shared experience of the Rivera confrontation had forged a bond that transcended their dramatic physical differences. "You know," Jake said one evening as they watched sunset paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson, "when I first saw you in my kitchen, I thought you looked lost." "I was lost," Elena replied, her right hand intertwined with Jake's. Massive fingers, but not geographically. "I was lost inside myself, convinced I was too damaged to deserve kindness or safety." "And now?" Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that still amazed Jake. "Now I know that being damaged doesn't make someone worthless. It makes them experienced enough to help others who are facing similar challenges." The foundation's success had attracted national attention, with Elena receiving invitations to speak at conferences and legislative hearings about domestic violence prevention. She'd initially been reluctant to become a public figure, fearing the exposure might attract new threats. But Jake's unwavering support and the ranch's proven security had given her the confidence to share her story on a larger stage. Elena's congressional testimony, delivered 18 months after Rivera's death, resulted in increased federal funding for domestic violence programs and stronger legal protections for survivors seeking to escape abusive relationships. The legislation that emerged from her advocacy became known as the Elena Martinez Act, ensuring that her name would be associated with hope rather than victimization. The ranch's kitchen, where Elena had first hidden her scars and struggled with simple tasks, had become the heart of a thriving operation that fed not only Jake's ranch hands, but also the staff and residents of the foundation's safe houses. Elena's adaptive cooking techniques had been documented and shared with other survivors dealing with physical disabilities, creating a network of mutual support and shared expertise. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept running," Elena mused during a quiet moment in the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. "If I'd been too afraid to trust Jake's offer of help." "You wouldn't have kept running forever," Jake replied with certainty. "You're too strong to have given up, even if it took longer to find your way home." The word home carried special significance for Elena. For the first time in her adult life, she lived somewhere by choice rather than necessity, somewhere she was valued for who she was rather than controlled for someone else's benefit. The Double Creek Ranch had given her more than physical safety. It had given her the space to discover who Elena Martinez could become when fear was no longer her constant companion. Elena's left arm would never fully heal from the damage Marcus Rivera had inflicted, but she'd learned to view her scars as evidence of survival rather than symbols of victimization. The adaptive equipment in her kitchen served as daily reminders that limitations could be overcome through creativity and determination. The ranch's guest book, filled with signatures from domestic violence survivors who'd found hope through Elena's Foundation had become one of her most treasured possessions. Each name represented someone who'd chosen courage over fear, someone who'd decided to fight for a better future despite the risks involved. "You saved my life," read one entry from a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage with the Foundation's help. "But more importantly, you showed me that my life was worth saving." Elena had framed that particular entry, hanging it in the kitchen where she could see it every day. The woman who'd once believed herself too damaged to deserve kindness had become someone who helped others discover their own worth and potential. As autumn returned to the Montana mountains, marking the second anniversary of Elena's arrival at the Double Creek Ranch, she stood once again at the kitchen window that had provided her first glimpse of safety. The view remained the same: endless sky, rolling pastures, and mountains that seemed to touch the horizon. But Elena's perspective had been transformed completely. The scared, damaged woman who'd hidden her scars beneath oversized clothing had become someone who wore her survival as a badge of honor. The cook who'd struggled to open jars and knead bread with one functional hand had become a culinary artist whose adaptive techniques inspired others facing similar challenges. Most importantly, the woman who'd spent years believing she belonged to someone else had discovered that she belonged to herself, and that belonging to herself meant having the freedom to choose love, purpose, and hope over fear. But Elena had made a decision during the long night of waiting that surprised everyone, including herself. "Jake, I'm not hiding in the bunker this time. Elena, we discussed this. The bunker is the safest place on the ranch. The safest place for me is wherever you can see me and protect me," Elena replied with quiet determination. "If Marcus breaks through your defenses, that bunker becomes a tomb. I'd rather face him standing up." Jake wanted to argue, but he recognized the resolve in Elena's voice. She'd spent 8 months running from Marcus Rivera, and she was done hiding. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Elena was determined to face it on her own terms. Rivera's assault began with a coordinated attack on 3 fronts, designed to overwhelm the ranch's defenses through sheer firepower and numbers. Automatic weapons fire erupted from positions throughout the property as Rivera's mercenaries attempted to advance on the main house under cover of suppressing fire. But Jake's defensive strategy had anticipated exactly this type of assault. Rather than trying to hold fixed positions against superior numbers, the ranch hands employed mobile tactics that used their knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. They would engage Rivera's men from concealed positions, inflict casualties, then withdraw to secondary positions before the enemy could concentrate fire on their locations. The FBI tactical team provided the backbone of the defense, using their superior training and equipment to coordinate the ranch hands' efforts into a cohesive defensive plan. Federal snipers positioned in the barn's hayloft began systematically eliminating Rivera's advance personnel, while tactical teams positioned in the outbuildings prevented the attackers from establishing secure firing positions. "Jake, we've got vehicles approaching from the north pasture," Tommy radioed from his position near the equipment shed. "Looks like Rivera's trying to flank our main defensive line." Jake adjusted his own position to counter the flanking attempt, leaving Elena in the main house under the protection of 2 FBI agents. Through the reinforced windows, he could see muzzle flashes throughout the property as the battle intensified. Turning point came when Rivera himself finally revealed his position. Jake caught sight of a familiar figure directing operations from behind one of the disabled vehicles, Marcus Rivera, shouting orders to his mercenaries while remaining safely behind cover. Even in the chaos of combat, Jake could see that Rivera was a physically small man whose power came from wealth and intimidation rather than personal courage. "Agent Chun, I have eyes on Rivera," Jake radioed to the FBI command position. "He's approximately 200 yards southeast of the main house, behind the burned-out SUV from the first attack. Copy that. Tactical team is moving to intercept." "But Rivera had seen the federal agents advancing on his position. Instead of attempting to escape or surrender, he began moving directly toward the main house with a small group of his most loyal mercenaries. Jake realized with growing horror that Rivera was making a final desperate attempt to reach Elena personally. All units, Rivera is moving on the main house, Jake announced over the communication system. Converge on the building immediately. Jake sprinted back toward the main house, arriving just as Rivera's group breached the reinforced front door using explosive charges. The blast shattered windows throughout the first floor and filled the interior with smoke and debris. Through the chaos, Jake could hear Rivera's voice calling for Elena with the possessive fury of someone reclaiming stolen property. "Elena, I know you're here. Come out and face me like the wife you swore to be." Jake entered the smoke-filled house through the kitchen entrance, moving toward Elena's last known position while trying to locate Rivera and his remaining men. The FBI agents assigned to protect Elena were unconscious near the staircase, victims of the explosive breach that had caught them by surprise. "Elena." Rivera's voice was closer now, filled with the rage of someone whose carefully constructed world had been destroyed by his victim's escape. 3 years I gave you. 3 years of my protection, my money, my love. And this is how you repay me? Jake found Elena barricaded behind the overturned dining room table, her right hand gripping a kitchen knife, while her damaged left arm hung uselessly at her side. Rivera was advancing on her position with a pistol drawn, his face twisted with the kind of fury that made rational thought impossible. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "It's over. The FBI has everything. Financial records, witness testimony, evidence of all your crimes. Even if you kill me, you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison." "Then I have nothing left to lose," Rivera replied, raising his weapon. Jake's shot took Rivera center mass, the impact of the .45 caliber round spinning him around and sending his pistol skittering across the debris-covered floor. Rivera collapsed against the wall, his expensive suit darkening with blood as he stared at Jake with disbelief and rage. "You don't understand," Rivera gasped, trying to reach his fallen weapon. "She belongs to me. Elena is mine." "Elena belongs to herself," Jake replied, keeping his weapon trained on the dying man. "She always has." Rivera's remaining mercenaries had been eliminated or captured by the converging FBI tactical teams, leaving the ranch house in an eerie silence broken only by Rivera's labored breathing. Agent Chun entered through the damaged front door, surveying the scene with professional calm. "Elena, are you hurt?" she asked. Elena shook her head, unable to speak as the reality of her freedom finally settled over her. Marcus Rivera, the man who'd controlled and terrorized her for years, was dying on the floor of the Montana ranch that had become her sanctuary. "It's over," Jake said gently, helping Elena to her feet. "Elena, it's really over. Rivera died before the paramedics could stabilize him for transport." His final words a curse directed at Elena for having the audacity to escape his control. With his death, the criminal organization that had hunted her across multiple states collapsed, leaving Elena free to rebuild her life without fear. The aftermath of the battle was swift and decisive. Rivera's surviving mercenaries were taken into federal custody, facing charges that would ensure decades in prison. The financial evidence Elena had provided led to the dismantling of Rivera's entire criminal empire, with dozens of arrests and asset forfeitures that crippled organized crime operations throughout the Southwest. Elena stood on the front porch of the Double Creek Ranch as federal investigators processed the crime scene, watching the sun set over the Montana mountains that had witnessed her final confrontation with the past. Jake stood beside her, his presence a reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now you get to find out what it's like to live without fear," Jake replied. Now you get to discover who Elena Martinez really is when she's not running or hiding. Elena smiled for the first time since Rivera's arrival, feeling the weight of 8 months of terror finally lifting from her shoulders. The scars on her left arm would always remind her of what she'd survived, but they would also remind her of her own strength and resilience. The Double Creek Ranch had given her more than sanctuary. It had given her the chance to fight back and win. 6 months after Marcus Rivera's death, Elena Martinez stood in the kitchen of the Double Creek Ranch, no longer hiding her scars beneath oversized clothing. The adaptive equipment that had once been a necessity for basic survival had evolved into tools of culinary artistry, allowing her to create elaborate meals that had transformed the ranch's reputation throughout the region. The federal trials resulting from Rivera's criminal empire had concluded with unprecedented success for prosecutors. Elena's testimony, delivered via secure video link from the ranch, had provided the foundation for convictions that dismantled an organization responsible for laundering over $200 million annually. 37 individuals received federal prison sentences, including corrupt officials who'd enabled Rivera's operations for years. The Justice Department wants to present you with a commendation for your cooperation in the investigation, Agent Chun explained during her final visit to the ranch. Your testimony resulted in the largest organized crime prosecution in Arizona's history. Elena accepted the recognition with quiet grace, but her focus had shifted entirely to building the future she'd never imagined possible. The woman who'd arrived at the Double Creek Ranch with nothing but a damaged arm and a lifetime of trauma had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Jake's ranch hands had become something more than employees during the months of preparation and battle. They'd become family. Tommy Sullivan had taken over much of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Jake to spend time helping Elena develop plans for expanding the ranch's hospitality services. Pete Morrison had accepted a position with the county sheriff's department, using his experience from the Rivera confrontation to improve rural law enforcement capabilities. The most significant change was Elena's decision to establish a foundation, providing assistance to domestic violence survivors seeking to rebuild their lives. Using a portion of the federal reward money she'd received for her cooperation in the Rivera investigation, Elena created safe houses and job training programs, specifically designed for women escaping abusive relationships. Every woman deserves the chance I had, Elena explained to a group of social workers visiting the ranch. The chance to discover who she really is when she's not afraid. The foundation's first safe house was located on property adjacent to the Double Creek Ranch, staffed by counselors and security personnel trained to deal with high-risk situations. Elena's own experience had taught her that escaping an abusive relationship was only the beginning of a much longer journey toward healing and independence. Jake had initially worried that Elena's foundation work might interfere with her recovery, forcing her to constantly revisit traumatic experiences. Instead, he discovered that helping other survivors had accelerated Elena's own healing process, giving her a sense of purpose that transcended her personal suffering. I spent 8 months running from my past, Elena told a group of domestic violence counselors during a training session. But I've learned that healing doesn't come from forgetting what happened. It comes from using what happened to help others. The ranch itself had been restored to its original function, though enhanced security measures remained in place. The bunker beneath the main house had been converted into a wine cellar, while the communications equipment Jake had installed during the crisis now served the foundation's operations. Elena's relationship with Jake had evolved naturally from protector and protected to genuine partnership. The giant rancher who'd risked everything to defend a woman he barely knew had discovered that Elena's courage and determination matched his own. Their shared experience of the Rivera confrontation had forged a bond that transcended their dramatic physical differences. "You know," Jake said one evening as they watched sunset paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson. When I first saw you in my kitchen, I thought you looked lost. I was lost, Elena replied, her right hand intertwined with Jake's. Massive fingers, but not geographically. I was lost inside myself, convinced I was too damaged to deserve kindness or safety. And now? Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that still amazed Jake. Now I know that being damaged doesn't make someone worthless. It makes them experienced enough to help others who are facing similar challenges. The Foundation's success had attracted national attention, with Elena receiving invitations to speak at conferences and legislative hearings about domestic violence prevention. She'd initially been reluctant to become a public figure, fearing the exposure might attract new threats. But Jake's unwavering support and the ranch's proven security had given her the confidence to share her story on a larger stage. Elena's congressional testimony, delivered 18 months after Rivera's death, resulted in increased federal funding for domestic violence programs and stronger legal protections for survivors seeking to escape abusive relationships. The legislation that emerged from her advocacy became known as the Elena Martinez Act, ensuring that her name would be associated with hope rather than victimization. The ranch's kitchen, where Elena had first hidden her scars and struggled with simple tasks, had become the heart of a thriving operation that fed not only Jake's ranch hands but also the staff and residents of the Foundation's safe houses. Elena's adaptive cooking techniques had been documented and shared with other survivors dealing with physical disabilities, creating a network of mutual support and shared expertise. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept running, Elena mused during a quiet moment in the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. If I'd been too afraid to trust Jake's offer of help. You wouldn't have kept running forever, Jake replied with certainty. You're too strong to have given up, even if it took longer to find your way home. The word home carried special significance for Elena. For the first time in her adult life, she lived somewhere by choice rather than necessity, somewhere she was valued for who she was rather than controlled for someone else's benefit. The Double Creek Ranch had given her more than physical safety. It had given her the space to discover who Elena Martinez could become when fear was no longer her constant companion. Elena's left arm would never fully heal from the damage Marcus Rivera had inflicted, but she'd learned to view her scars as evidence of survival rather than symbols of victimization. The adaptive equipment in her kitchen served as daily reminders that limitations could be overcome through creativity and determination. The ranch's guest book, filled with signatures from domestic violence survivors who'd found hope through Elena's foundation, had become one of her most treasured possessions. Each name represented someone who'd chosen courage over fear, someone who'd decided to fight for a better future despite the risks involved. You saved my life, read one entry from a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage with the Foundation's help. But more importantly, you showed me that my life was worth saving. Elena had framed that particular entry, hanging it in the kitchen where she could see it every day. The woman who'd once believed herself too damaged to deserve kindness had become someone who helped others discover their own worth and potential. As autumn returned to the Montana mountains, marking the second anniversary of Elena's arrival at the Double Creek Ranch, she stood once again at the kitchen window that had provided her first glimpse of safety. The view remained the same, endless sky, rolling pastures, and mountains that seemed to touch the horizon. But Elena's perspective had been transformed completely. The scared, damaged woman who'd hidden her scars beneath oversized clothing had become someone who wore her survival as a badge of honor. The cook who'd struggled to open jars and knead bread with one functional hand had become a culinary artist whose adaptive techniques inspired others facing similar challenges. Most importantly, the woman who'd spent years believing she belonged to someone else had discovered that she belonged to herself, and that belonging to herself meant having the freedom to choose love, purpose, And hope over fear. Elena Martinez had found more than sanctuary at the Double Creek Ranch. She'd found the courage to become who she was always meant to be. Not a victim of someone else's cruelty, but a survivor strong enough to help others find their own path to freedom. The kitchen where her new life had begun continued to fill with the aromas of fresh bread and perfectly seasoned meals. But now those scents carried something more than nourishment. They carried the promise that even the most damaged people could heal, that even the most frightened could find courage, and that even the most broken could become whole again. Elena's story had begun with scars and ended with strength. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth sharing with anyone who needed to believe that escape was possible, that healing was real, and that home was more than just a place. It was a feeling of safety, belonging, and unconditional acceptance. The Double Creek Ranch had given Elena Martinez the greatest gift possible, the chance to discover that she was worth saving, worth protecting, and worth loving exactly as she was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.